"I'm sorry, ma'am. Your name isn't on the memorial list." That was the first thing I heard 2 weeks after my husband died. Not condolences, not respect, not even silence. Just a young assistant blocking my path while guests filed into a ceremony I helped build with my own money, my own years, my own marriage. I thought she had made a mistake. Then I looked up. Corwin's memorial plaque stood at the center of the hall, surrounded by cameras and people dressed in expensive grief. His children were already there, Sabine smiling for the press like she owned the air, Lysander shaking hands with board members like a man stepping into a crown. I scanned the engraved names slowly, found Corwin, found the company founders, found distant partners who barely knew him. My name wasn't there, not once. The room didn't feel loud anymore, yet it felt organized, intentional. Sabine spotted me standing near the entrance and walked over with that soft voice she used when she wanted to look kind without being kind at all. "We had to make some adjustments," she said, touching my arm lightly. "This memorial reflects permanent family." Permanent. The word landed harder than the omission. Before I could answer, Lysander stepped onto the stage and cleared his throat, announcing a necessary leadership transition, so soon after Corwin's death that a few people exchanged uneasy looks. He spoke about stability, about protecting the business, about moving forward, and every sentence sounded like it had been rehearsed long before the funeral ended. Vance appeared beside me, already furious. "This is strategic," he whispered. "They're setting a narrative. That you were temporary. Yeah, we filed today. Injunction, board challenge, everything." I watched Sabine smiling at the cameras, watched Quentin, the new advisor nobody introduced to me, leaning close to Lysander, guiding him through conversations like a puppeteer who knew the script better than the actors. And suddenly, I understood something deeper than grief. They weren't just pushing me out. They were rushing. People who rush are usually hiding something. Vance kept talking, listing legal options, warning me that silence would cost me control. Around us, whispers spread. Some pitied me. Some looked relieved. A few waited for a scene, for tears or anger or anything that would confirm the story Sabine had already planted. I gave them none of it. When the ceremony ended and reporters drifted closer, Sabine raised her voice just enough for everyone to hear. "And we appreciate Ardella's support during this difficult time," she said. "She understands the company belongs to Corwin's bloodline." A clean cut disguised as gratitude. Vance stiffened beside me. "Say something," he urged. I stepped forward instead, calm enough that even I didn't recognize my own voice when it came out. "Give them everything." The words spread through the room like a dropped glass, quiet at first, then sharp. Sabine blinked, surprised. Lysander's shoulders loosened, confidence replacing caution. Quentin smiled too quickly. Vance stared at me like I had just signed away 30 years in one sentence. But I wasn't thinking about loss. I was watching patterns. Who looked relieved, who avoided eye contact, who celebrated too early. As people began leaving, Maris approached me slowly, holding a thin folder against her chest. Warren, she didn't hug me. She didn't offer sympathy. Her eyes kept drifting towards Sabine and Lysander, laughing with Quentin near the stage. "I know you told everyone you're stepping aside," she said quietly. "I am." She hesitated, then pressed the folder into my hands anyway. "Just don't sign anything yet," she whispered. "Something isn't right with the numbers." I didn't open it. Not there. Not while Sabine waved goodbye like a woman who believed she had already won. I just held the folder and looked once more at the plaque where my name used to live. Not in metal, but in years nobody could erase. And for the first time since Corwin died, I felt something sharper than grief settle into place. They thought I walked away because I was weak. They didn't realize I was standing still long enough to see exactly where they were running. And the first thing that stopped working was my access card. No warning, no meeting, no explanation. Just a soft red light blinking at me like the building had already forgotten who I was. I tried again, slower this time, thinking maybe my hand was shaking too much. The guard behind the desk shifted uncomfortably but didn't come over. He had known me for years, used to greet me by name, but now he kept his eyes on a tablet like I was a stranger waiting for clearance. "System update," he said finally, not looking up. "Temporary adjustments." Temporary. That word again. I didn't argue. I stepped aside and watched as Sabine walked through the doors with her badge glowing green, laughing into her phone like the company had always belonged to her. Lysander followed minutes later with Quentin beside him. Tall, composed, all too comfortable in a space he had never earned. He barely acknowledged me, just nodded politely like I was a former consultant passing through old memories. Inside, my office had already been cleared. The glass shelves where Corwin and I kept awards were empty. My chair was gone. Even the framed photo of our first warehouse had disappeared from the wall, leaving behind a pale square that looked like a scar. A junior assistant stood in the corner packing the last box, avoiding my eyes. "Who told you to do this?" I asked gently. She hesitated. Mr. Lysander said, "Restructuring." Of course he did. I walked slowly through the hallway, noticing how conversations dropped when I passed. Staff who once came to me with problems now turned toward Quentin for approval. He moved through departments like a storm wrapped in a smile, or talking about liquidity and efficiency, encouraging rapid asset sales as if stability was something outdated. Grief didn't feel like crying anymore. It felt like listening, watching, counting how many decisions were being made too quickly. In the boardroom, Quentin projected numbers onto a screen, explaining why certain long-term investments needed to be sold immediately. Sabine nodded eagerly, her pen tapping the table like she was trying to keep up with a language she barely understood. Lysander asked questions, but his focus wasn't on caution. It was on speed. "Legacy models don't survive modern markets," Quentin said smoothly. "We move now or fall behind." Legacy. Another word that sounded harmless until you realized it meant erasing what came before. I stayed near the back, unnoticed, listening to projections that didn't align with what I remembered from Corwin's final strategy sessions. The numbers weren't outrageous, just rushed, like someone pushing a house to sell before anyone checked the foundation. Later, in the hallway, Naraya caught up with me. She had worked in logistics longer than anyone else, a woman who rarely spoke unless something truly mattered. "They don't see you anymore," she said quietly, not unkindly. "That's fine," I replied. But it wasn't about being seen. It was about what people stopped saying when they thought you weren't watching. She handed me a tablet with shipment logs open on the screen. "We've had 3 outgoing transfers this week that bypass normal approval routes," she said, her voice low. "I asked Maris to verify, but the numbers don't match the inventory." I scrolled slowly, recognizing warehouse codes, delivery routes, patterns that used to make perfect sense. Now they looked incomplete. "Maybe it's restructuring," I said, testing the word. Naraya shook her head. "Restructuring doesn't erase paper trails?" Across the hall, Sabine's laughter echoed as she walked past with Quentin and Lysander, already discussing another round of asset reviews. None of them glanced in my direction. None of them seemed worried, which worried me more. I closed the tablet and handed it back to Naraya. "Keep watching," I said. She studied my face carefully. "You're really going to let them take everything?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I looked around the building. The polished floors, the quiet offices, the people moving like they were trying to adjust to a new gravity. For years, yet this place had felt like a home built from work and trust. Now it felt like a house where the locks had been changed while I was still inside. "I already told them," I said finally. "They can have it." Naraya's eyes narrowed slightly, like she didn't believe me. Then she leaned closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "There's something else," she said. "Shipments are leaving the warehouses without proper logs, and someone high up is signing off on it." For the first time that day, I felt a small shift inside me. Not anger, not panic, just a quiet tightening, like a thread pulling into focus. Because people don't rush to erase records unless they're afraid of what someone might find later. Sabine chose the restaurant carefully, private room, long table, enough witnesses to make anything said feel official. I knew the moment I walked in that this wasn't a family dinner. It was a stage. Lysander sat at the head like he had inherited more than grief, Quentin beside him flipping through documents even before the first glass of water touched the table. Cameras weren't allowed inside, but the people present were the kind who would carry stories back into the world for them. Sabine smiled when she saw me. Not warm, expectant. She was waiting for a scene. "I'm glad you came," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "We thought it was important to clear the air. Privately." Privately never means private when there's an audience. Vance sat beside me, already tense. He leaned close. "If they push you, we respond. No more silence." But silence wasn't weakness. Silence was observation. Dinner barely started before Sabine began. She spoke about legacy, about transparency, about correcting misunderstandings. Each sentence sounded rehearsed, like she had practiced it in front of a mirror. "We don't want conflict," she said, placing her napkin neatly on her lap. "We just want what's rightfully ours." Several heads nodded around the table. Then she turned to me, eyes soft but sharp underneath. "If you have nothing to hide, Ardella, maybe you could explain why you stepped away so quickly." There it was, not a question, an accusation dressed like concern. The room waited. Lysander watched me carefully, like he was trying to read whether I would fight or fold. Quentin didn't look at me at all. He kept scanning the documents in front of him, occasionally whispering something into Lysander's ear. I picked up my glass, took a slow sip, and set it back down. "No, I said you could have everything," I replied calmly. "What exactly is left to argue about?" A flicker of irritation crossed Sabine's face. She had expected anger, tears, something she could frame as instability. Instead, my calm turned the room uncomfortable. Without a fight, the story started writing itself differently. Someone at the far end of the table cleared their throat. "It's unusual," he said carefully. "Most people would defend themselves." Another voice added, "Unless they felt responsible for something." And just like that, the narrative shifted. Silence became guilt. Not defending myself made people believe there must be something to defend against. Vance shifted beside me, ready to interrupt, but I placed a hand lightly on the table, a small signal for him to wait. Sabine leaned forward, sensing momentum. "And we just want transparency," she said. "The company deserves honesty after everything that's happened." I nodded slowly. "Then you should make your decisions carefully," I said. She blinked, thrown off by the lack of resistance. Conversation moved on, but the tone had changed. People watched me differently now, not as a widow pushed aside, but as a question mark they couldn't solve. Whispers formed between courses. Eyes lingered a little longer. Good, because people talk more when they think you're not defending yourself. While the others argued over future asset reviews, I opened my phone under the table and began typing small notes, dates, decisions, phrases. Quentin repeated, the way Lysander approved things without asking for full reports. Not accusations, just records. Patterns matter more than opinions. When dinner ended, Sabine walked me to the hallway with a smile that almost looked relieved. "I'm glad you're cooperating," she said. "It makes this easier for everyone." "For who?" I asked gently. She didn't answer. Outside, the night air felt colder than it should have. Vance exhaled sharply. "They're building a case against you," he said. "You realize that, right? Your silence lets them control the story." "I know," I said. He studied me like he was waiting for the rest of the sentence, but there wasn't one. Across the street, Maris hurried toward us, clutching her bag tightly. Her face looked pale under the streetlights, eyes darting like she expected someone to follow. "I didn't want to say this in there," she whispered, pulling me slightly aside. "What is it?" She opened her tablet and turned the screen toward me. All lines of transactions filled the display, numbers moving faster than I remembered from Corwin's last reports. "These transfers, they're irregular," she said quietly. "They're being pushed through under emergency authorization." "By who?" Vance asked. Maris hesitated for a fraction of a second, then pointed to a signature line, Lysander's name. The air between us went still. "I double-checked," she added, her voice tight. "And it's not just one or two. There's a pattern, and it started the day after the memorial." The quieter I became, the louder everyone else sounded. I didn't attend the emergency strategy meeting that Sabine announced the next morning, but that didn't stop the messages from reaching me. Staff forwarded clips, summaries, whispers. The Quentin had taken the floor like he owned it, presenting charts filled with sharp red arrows pointing downward, insisting the company needed immediate liquidity. Immediate. It was his favorite word. "Legacy assets drain growth," he said during the meeting, according to Naraya. "Sell the slow pieces now while the market is still forgiving." Slow pieces. That was how he described the warehouses Corwin built from scratch, the land that had carried us through recessions, the contracts that paid steadily even when trends shifted. Sabine nodded eagerly, asking how fast they could move. Lysander hesitated more, but every time he paused, Quentin leaned closer and whispered something that brought him back to agreement. Silence, apparently, made people braver. The board began dividing quietly. Some believed Quentin's urgency, while others exchanged looks that said they remembered how Corwin used to wait before making big decisions. Without me arguing, the debate grew sharper, louder, more revealing. People exposed their fears when they thought nobody was listening. I watched from a distance. Grief had turned into observation so gradually I barely noticed when it happened. That afternoon, I drove to a small cafe near the old shipping docks, a place Corwin used to visit whenever he needed to think without interruption. Odell was already there, seated at a corner table with a newspaper folded in precise halves. He didn't stand when I approached. He just looked at me over his glasses with that steady, unreadable expression that had made half the board nervous for years. "You're quieter than I expected," he said. "They're louder than I expected," I replied, and a faint smile touched his mouth. "That's what happens when people believe nobody is watching." I ordered tea and sat across from him. Outside, trucks moved slowly along the dock roads, the rhythm of work continuing whether families fought or not. "They're pushing to sell long-term assets," I said. "I know," Odell answered. "They called me yesterday, asked for my vote." "And?" I told them I needed time. He folded his hands together. "Quentin speaks like a man who wants fast exits, not long futures." That matched everything I had seen. Odell studied me carefully. "Corwin worried about this," he said after a moment. "Not the children, not exactly, but the pressure that comes when people believe leadership is weak after loss." My chest tightened slightly at the mention of Corwin's voice, his caution. Oh, the late nights we spent talking through scenarios that felt distant back then. "What did he do about it?" I asked. Odell leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the window like he was measuring how much to reveal. "He prepared," he said simply. "Not loudly, not publicly, but he built safeguards into the structure, in case the wrong hands rushed decisions." The words settled between us. Prepared. Safeguards. I thought about the irregular transfers Maris showed me, the shipments Naraya couldn't trace, the way Quentin pushed speed like urgency was a virtue. "Why didn't he tell me?" I asked quietly. "He trusted you to see patterns," Odell replied. "Corwin believed you understood timing better than anyone." A strange warmth mixed with sadness moved through me. Trust always feels heavier after someone is gone. "Well, what kind of safeguards?" I pressed. Odell's gaze sharpened. "Legal architecture," he said. "Clauses designed to activate under certain conditions, not punishments, consequences." The word consequences lingered. I leaned forward slightly. "And what triggers them?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stirred his coffee slowly, the spoon tapping against porcelain in a steady rhythm. "Has anyone challenged your silence yet?" he asked. "Every day. And you still haven't fought back?" "No." Odell nodded once, like a man confirming a theory. "Good," he said softly, "because some clauses only reveal themselves when someone willingly steps aside." A chill moved through me. Not fear, just recognition. "What clause?" I asked. He held my gaze for a long moment, then lowered his voice. "There's one nobody has triggered yet," he said. "A condition Corwin insisted on after the last internal conflict years ago. It doesn't activate through force, only through surrender." Surrender. The word echoed differently now. Before I could ask more, Odell leaned back and closed the subject with a small shake of his head. "You'll understand when the time comes," he said. "But remember this, Ardella. People reveal their intentions when they believe victory is already theirs." Outside the cafe, a truck horn sounded, long and low like a warning carried on the wind, and for the first time since the plaque erased my name, I felt the shape of something forming beneath the chaos. Not revenge, not yet, just a quiet structure, waiting for the right moment to stand on its own. The first crack didn't come quietly. It arrived as a headline. "De Corwin Logistics loses Northern Freight contract amid leadership transition." My phone lit up before sunrise. Messages from former employees, industry contacts, even people who hadn't spoken to me in years. The Northern Freight agreement wasn't just another deal. It was one of the oldest contracts Corwin built himself, steady and dependable, the kind that didn't make noise but kept everything stable underneath the flashier projects. Lysander lost it in 3 weeks. 3. I didn't celebrate. Loss never feels like victory when you helped build what's breaking. But I watched closely. Sabine held a press briefing that afternoon, standing in front of cameras with practiced confidence. "Transitions come with challenges," she said smoothly. Some contracts were structured under outdated models that no longer serve the company's future." Outdated. That word again, a clean way to bury history. Then she said my name. "We respect Ardella's past contributions," she added, her tone tightening slightly, "but certain decisions made before this leadership era created long-term vulnerabilities." There it was, blame dressed as professionalism. I turned off the video before the questions started. The real story wasn't in the cameras, it was in the hallways. By midday, Naraya sent me a short message. 2 resignations already. By evening, there were 5. Not dramatic exits, quiet ones. Senior staff who didn't believe in fast liquidation or Quentin's aggressive timelines. People who had watched Corwin build patiently and now felt the ground shifting too quickly beneath them. And grief didn't sting the way it used to. It sharpened my focus. That night, I sat at a small desk in my apartment. Not the executive office I once had, just a simple workspace overlooking a busy street, and drafted my first advisory proposal. Nothing grand, a logistics consultancy offering strategic guidance to smaller companies that needed stability more than speed. No announcement, no press release, just a beginning. The first client came from an old contact who said, "We trust your judgment more than the noise around you." Dignity doesn't always return through power. Sometimes it comes back through usefulness. 2 days later, I walked into a modest conference room across town to meet with a family-owned distributor struggling with expansion decisions. The owner recognized me immediately, his handshake firm but cautious. "I didn't expect you to start something new so soon," he said. "Neither did I replied honestly. We spent hours reviewing numbers, discussing long-term growth instead of short-term headlines. For the first time since Corwin died, I felt something close to balance, not healing, but forward motion. Across the city, the company I once helped lead continued unraveling in small, visible ways. Board members began questioning Quentin's projections. Investors requested additional reporting. Sabine grew louder in interviews, repeating that legacy thinking held them back, a phrase that earned more raised eyebrows each time she used it. And still, I said nothing publicly. Silence made them louder. Louder made them careless. Late that evening, Naraya called instead of texting. Her voice sounded tighter than usual. "You heard about the resignations?" she asked. "Yes." "There's more," she said. "People are talking, not openly, but enough that it's spreading. Some think the contract loss happened because decisions were rushed without full review." "That's not surprising." She hesitated, like she was deciding whether to cross a line she couldn't uncross. "I shouldn't be telling you this," she said finally, "but someone filed a whistleblower report today." The words landed heavier than any headline. "Against who?" I asked quietly. "I don't know the full details yet," she admitted. "It went through internal compliance, not public channels. But the timing, it's connected to the shipments and the transfers Maris showed you." I leaned back in my chair, looking at the stack of advisory notes in front of me, proof that life outside the company was already forming new shapes. "Be careful," I said to her. "I am," she replied. Then her voice dropped lower. "Ardella, people are starting to question Quentin's influence, and if this report moves forward, it won't stay quiet for long." After the call ended, I sat in silence for a while, listening to the faint noise of traffic below my window. The first crack had finally appeared, not because I fought, because they moved too fast when they believed nobody was watching. Maris stopped sleeping the week the numbers stopped making sense. She told me that later, not as a confession, just a quiet fact. But I could already see it in the way she sat across from me that evening, shoulders tense, so fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of tea she barely touched. The cafe was nearly empty, rain tapping softly against the windows, the kind of place where nobody listened unless you wanted them to. "I keep rechecking the reports," she said, voice low. "Every time I think I've found the mistake, another one appears." I didn't interrupt. Silence makes truth move faster. She opened her tablet and turned it toward me. Rows of projections filled the screen. Aggressive growth forecasts. Quentin had pushed through the board, numbers that looked impressive until you noticed how little they matched actual inventory flow. Shipments leaving without full documentation, she continued. Inventory values inflated just enough to justify selling certain assets. It's subtle. Not illegal on the surface. Just wrong. The word hung between us. Wrong. Not revenge, not sabotage, just a quiet distortion of reality that grew larger each day. I folded my hands on the table. "What do you need from me?" She blinked, surprised. "I thought you'd ask how to stop it." "I didn't come here to stop anything," I said gently. "I just want clarity." Her shoulders loosened slightly, like she had been bracing for anger that never arrived. Across the city, Sabine had already begun another media push, framing recent losses as part of a necessary evolution. Lysander approved Quentin's revised projections despite internal doubts, and more staff quietly requested transfers to other departments or resigned altogether. The atmosphere inside the company felt heavier even from a distance. Not chaos, just a growing pressure that nobody could quite name. Maris scrolled to another page. "These transfers," she said, tapping the screen, "they're authorized under emergency restructuring guidelines. Lysander's signature is there, but the supporting documents don't align with our usual audit trail." I studied the pattern carefully. Dates, amounts, routing codes. Not dramatic, just consistent enough to matter. "Do you think he understands what he's approving?" I asked. She hesitated. "I think he trusts Quentin too much." That felt closer to the truth. People don't always make bad decisions because they're reckless. Sometimes they just follow the wrong voice at the wrong moment. "I'm not here to prove anyone guilty," I said quietly, "only to understand what's happening." Maris exhaled slowly, relief flickering across her face. "That's why I came to you," she admitted. "Everyone else wants sides." "You just listen." Listening had become my strongest weapon. Later that night, she returned to her office to review one last batch of reports. The building was mostly empty, lights dimmed, hallways quiet, the kind of stillness that makes every sound feel louder. She opened a folder labeled Vendor Analysis, expecting routine confirmations. Instead, she froze. One of the external consulting payments traced back to a shell company she didn't recognize. She ran the registration number through an internal database, then an external search. Her hand stilled on the keyboard. The shell company wasn't random. It connected to a logistics firm that had tried and failed to acquire Corwin's company years ago, a rival known for aggressive buyouts and short-term asset stripping. Quentin's consulting entity appeared on both records. Same address. Same financial backers. Maris stared at the screen, the glow reflecting in her tired eyes. For a long moment, she didn't move. Then she grabbed her phone and called me. "I think I found something," she whispered the moment I answered. "What is it?" Her voice dropped even lower, like saying it out loud made it more real. "Quentin isn't just advising them," she said. "He has ties to a rival firm, one that tried to take us over years ago." The invitations arrived before the deal was even finalized. Gold lettering, private venue, a leadership renewal reception hosted by Sabine, a celebration that felt too early, too confident, like someone applauding a victory before the race ended. I stared at the card for a long moment before setting it down on my desk. 2 months ago, I would have planned events like that with Corwin. Choosing the music, reviewing guest lists, making sure every message carried weight. Now Sabine was writing the story without me and rushing it. Naraya called that morning with an update that confirmed what I already sensed. 3 more asset sales pushed through overnight, she said. Lysander approved them all. Without board review? I asked. Technically, there was a review, she replied carefully. But Quentin presented everything as urgent. Some members signed off without full analysis. Urgent again. The faster they moved, the less time anyone had to question patterns. Later that evening, I attended Sabine's reception, not because I wanted to celebrate, but because absence would have fed the narrative she was building about me. The venue glittered with soft lighting and polished speeches. Sabine greeted guests like a woman stepping into legacy, her confidence louder than the music. "You came," she said, surprise flickering across her face. "I was invited," I replied. Her smile returned quickly, practiced, and public. "We're finally moving forward," she said. "It's what Dad would have wanted." I didn't argue. Arguing would have slowed her down. Across the room, Lysander stood with Quentin, reviewing documents even during the celebration, their heads bent together like conspirators. He looked energized, sharper than I had seen him since the funeral. But beneath the surface, I noticed small signs of strain, the way he rubbed his temple between conversations, the way his eyes searched the room as if he expected something to go wrong. And then there was the hesitation. And not from Sabine. She moved with certainty, but from another heir standing near the edge of the gathering, quieter, watching more than speaking. He nodded when people praised the company's new direction, but his smile never fully settled. Doubt lives in small gestures, a delayed reaction, a hand that lingers too long on a glass, a gaze that drifts toward exits instead of stages. People rushing toward power rarely notice who slows down behind them. Sabine raised a toast halfway through the evening, thanking investors, advisors, and those who believed in a future unburdened by the past. Some guests applauded loudly, others clapped out of politeness. Quentin stood beside Lysander, whispering something that made him laugh. A sound too relaxed for someone carrying responsibility this heavy. I watched them carefully, noting who approached them, who congratulated them too eagerly. Victory makes people careless. As the night wound down, Vance found me near the terrace, his expression sharper than usual. He didn't waste time on small talk. "They're drafting settlement documents already," he said quietly. "Sabine wants everything finalized quickly. Ownership transfer, board restructuring, the full separation." "I expected that," I replied. He studied me for a moment, like he was trying to understand how I stayed so calm while the ground shifted around us. "I've been reviewing Corwin's original legal structure," he added, "and something doesn't add up." "What do you mean?" Vance glanced back toward the room, making sure nobody stood close enough to overhear. "The way they're pushing you to surrender, it might activate a condition we haven't considered." My pulse didn't race. It slowed. "What kind of condition?" "I'm not sure yet," he admitted. "But Corwin built layers into those agreements. If you voluntarily step aside under certain terms, there could be a trigger hidden inside the settlement, something that changes how authority is measured after the transfer." The music swelled behind us, applause rising as Sabine finished another speech. She looked radiant under the lights, completely convinced the future belonged to her. "What happens if there is a trigger?" I asked softly. Vance's eyes held mine, serious and searching. "Then this entire celebration," he said, "might be happening far too soon." The announcement didn't happen in a courtroom. It happened in a quiet boardroom on a Tuesday morning. No cameras, no dramatic speeches. Just a long table, a stack of documents, and people waiting for me to finally fight back. Sabine sat across from me with a confidence that had grown louder every day. Lysander flipped through settlement drafts, his pen tapping softly against the pages. Quentin leaned back in his chair like a man already counting outcomes. Vance stood beside me, silent but tense. They expected negotiation. Instead, I spoke first. "I'm ready to formalize my withdrawal," I said calmly. "Full surrender of ownership and voting rights under the conditions already drafted." The room went still. Even Quentin sat forward slightly. Sabine blinked once, then smiled, slow and satisfied. "I'm glad you've decided to cooperate," she said, or her voice soft enough to sound gracious but sharp enough to claim victory. Lysander studied me more carefully. "No revisions?" he asked. "No additional protections?" "No revisions," I replied. Vance shifted beside me, but he didn't interrupt. He knew the moment wasn't about resistance. It was about timing. Quentin cleared his throat. "Then we should accelerate the final hearing," he said, already flipping through his calendar. "The sooner this is settled, the sooner the company stabilizes." Stabilizes. That word always sounded harmless when people wanted to move quickly. Outside the boardroom, the announcement spread faster than I expected. By evening, industry blogs carried headlines questioning my judgment. Some called it graceful acceptance. Others called it proof I never belonged in leadership to begin with. Then a former colleague texted me, "Why would you give away everything you built?" I didn't answer. Public opinion turned quietly against me. Without a fight, people filled the silence with assumptions. Friends stopped calling as often. Investors spoke about fresh vision. Even a few former allies suggested grief had clouded my thinking. Let them believe that. Confidence makes people careless. Quentin grew bolder in meetings, pushing Sabine and Lysander toward a fast final hearing. Momentum matters, he told them during one of the recorded briefings Naraya later showed me. If Ardella signs willingly, we control the narrative completely. Control. He believed the story was already finished. That evening, I drove to the old Dock Cafe again, the place where Corwin and I used to sit when decisions felt too heavy for office walls. Odell waited at the same table as before, newspaper folded neatly, eyes sharp behind quiet patience. "You made your move," he said without greeting. "I did. And they think you've surrendered." I allowed myself a small smile. "That seems to be the general opinion." Odell nodded slowly, as if confirming a calculation. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Outside, ships moved along the water, steady and unhurried, the opposite of everything happening inside the company now. Then he reached into his coat pocket and placed a small sealed envelope on the table between us. It was plain, unmarked, heavier than it looked. "Corwin left this with me," Odell said quietly. "And he told me to give it to you only if the company ever moved into hands that rushed more than they listened." My fingers hovered over the envelope without touching it. "When did he give this to you?" I asked. "Years ago," Odell replied. "After the last internal dispute. He said you would understand when the time came." The room felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker with memory. "What's inside?" I asked. Odell shook his head. "I never opened it. It wasn't mine to read." I picked it up slowly, feeling the weight of Corwin's handwriting pressing through the paper. Behind us, a truck horn echoed across the docks. Long, steady, patient. "They're pushing for a final hearing within days," I said softly. Odell's eyes didn't leave mine. "Then you'd better decide whether surrender means losing or revealing." I slid my thumb under the edge of the seal, but paused before breaking it. Because sometimes, the moment before you know the truth feels heavier than the truth itself. I didn't open the envelope right away. I carried it home, set it on the table, and stared at it longer than I care to admit. Corwin's handwriting sat across the front, steady, unmistakable, the same careful script he used when he wanted something to outlive him. When I finally broke the seal, a thin stack of documents slid into my hands. Not emotional letters, not apologies, structure, legal notes, margin comments, a short handwritten page folded between formal drafts. I sat down slowly, reading line by line, feeling the room grow quieter with every paragraph. Corwin hadn't feared losing the company to competition. He feared it collapsing from inside. Years before his death, he had worked with Vance and Odell to build layered protections into the ownership structure. Not obvious traps, not punishments, just conditions designed to activate when leadership moved too quickly without proper oversight. The language was precise, almost cold. Voluntary surrender, accelerated liquidation, emergency restructuring. Each phrase tied to a response hidden deeper in the legal framework. I traced his handwriting on the margin of one page. If they rush, the system will reveal itself, not stop them. Reveal them. A memory surfaced. Late nights at the dining table while he reviewed contracts, the way he always paused before signing anything tied to long-term assets. I used to tease him about being overly cautious. Now I understood it wasn't caution. It was preparation. The handwritten note folded inside the documents felt more personal than the rest. "Ardella," it began, "if you're reading this, it means the company is moving faster than it should. Don't fight speed with resistance. Let them choose it. Some protections only activate when surrender looks voluntary." My chest tightened. Not with sadness, but with recognition. He trusted me to see patterns the way he did. Across the city, Sabine and Lysander were already celebrating the final hearing date. Quentin had scheduled press outreach before the agreement was even complete, confident that my silence meant weakness. I read through the legal drafts again, slower this time, focusing on a section buried deep beneath technical language, on a clause tied to voluntary relinquishment, one that required a full operational audit if ownership transferred under accelerated conditions. It wasn't obvious unless you knew where to look. Not revenge, accountability. I called Vance. He answered on the second ring, his voice already tense. "I've been waiting to hear from you." I opened Corwin's envelope. I said quietly. Silence filled the line for a moment. "And?" "He built safeguards," I replied. "Not against them. Against the way they're rushing." I heard him exhale slowly like a man who had suspected the truth but needed confirmation. "Then we have leverage," he said. "Not leverage," I corrected gently. "Timing." I explained what I had found, the structure, the trigger conditions, the audit clause buried beneath layers of language. Vance didn't interrupt, but I could hear papers shifting on his end as he pulled up the same documents. "They'll never notice this," he said finally. "They don't need to notice," I answered. "They just need to keep moving." Outside my window, the city lights flickered on one by one, steady and patient. I thought about Sabine's speeches, Lysander's signatures, Quentin's urgency. None of them realized that surrender wasn't the opposite of control. Sometimes it was the key that opened a different door. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Vance asked quietly. "Once we prepare the agreement their way, there's no turning back." I closed Corwin's letter and placed it carefully beside me. "I'm sure," I said, because Corwin hadn't asked me to fight. He had asked me to understand. "Prepare the settlement exactly as they want it," I told Vance. "Every condition. Every timeline. No resistance." There was a pause on the other end. Not doubt, just respect for the weight of the decision. "Exactly as they want," he repeated slowly. "Yes." I ended the call and looked again at Corwin's handwriting, the quiet certainty behind every word. Across the city, they believed victory was already theirs, and for the first time, I felt ready to let them believe it. Victory makes people louder. Sabine didn't wait for the final hearing before acting like the company already belonged to her. By the end of the week, internal announcements rolled out one after another. Leadership changes, departmental realignments, new faces introduced as strategic hires. And senior staff who had worked alongside Corwin for decades were replaced in public meetings with younger executives who nodded quickly at Quentin's projections and rarely asked questions. The language stayed polite. The message didn't. Lysander stood beside Sabine during one announcement streamed to employees, talking about fresh energy and modern direction. His voice sounded confident, but I noticed the slight hesitation whenever Quentin handed him a new document to sign. He wasn't reckless, just convinced that speed meant strength. Outside the company walls, the industry buzzed with speculation. Some investors praised the bold restructuring. Others wondered quietly why so many experienced managers were leaving at once. Every headline made Sabine stand taller. They believed momentum meant security. Yet they didn't see how thin momentum becomes when it moves too fast. I watched from a distance, working quietly from my new advisory office, a small space with plain furniture and a view of the river. Clients came steadily now, drawn not by sympathy, but by trust. Each meeting felt like reclaiming a piece of myself that had nothing to do with inheritance battles or public narratives. Dignity doesn't need applause. It just needs purpose. One afternoon, Maris arrived unannounced, her expression sharper than I had seen in weeks. She closed the office door carefully before speaking. "They're celebrating internally," she said. "Quentin told the board the transition is already complete in practice." "That doesn't surprise me," I replied. She set a folder on the desk. I started compiling everything: transfers, shipment gaps, projections that don't match inventory. I'm not accusing anyone yet, just documenting. I nodded. That's enough. She looked at me carefully. You're not angry? I'm paying attention, I said. That answer seemed to calm her more than any reassurance could have. Later that evening, she returned to her office and continued building her quiet archive. Timestamps, authorization codes, communication logs. Each detail felt small on its own, but together they formed a pattern too precise to ignore. Across the city, Sabine hosted another internal celebration. Champagne glasses raised in conference rooms that once held strategy discussions with Corwin. She introduced new department heads publicly, thanking Quentin for guiding the company into its next chapter. Employees clapped politely. Some looked relieved. Others watched in silence. Well, momentum had turned into performance. Meanwhile, Vance finalized the settlement draft exactly as Sabine's team requested. Accelerated timelines, voluntary relinquishment language, clauses framed to make my withdrawal look uncomplicated and complete. He called me late that night, his voice quieter than usual. They approved every term, he said. No negotiations, no revisions. That was expected, I replied. They're moving fast enough that they didn't question the deeper sections, he added carefully. I knew what he meant. Buried beneath technical language, the voluntary surrender clause now included a mandatory operational audit, triggered automatically once ownership transferred under accelerated conditions. Not obvious, not dramatic, just precise. Is it written clearly enough to hold? I asked. It's stronger than I thought, Vance said, but they didn't notice it. Outside my window, the city lights reflected off the water like scattered glass. I imagined Sabine raising another toast, Lysander signing another approval, Quentin smiling at a future he believed he controlled. They think the agreement ends everything, Vance said quietly. It begins something, I corrected. He exhaled slowly. Then I'll send the draft for final signatures tomorrow. When the call ended, I sat alone for a while, listening to the steady hum of traffic below. Celebration has a sound. Louder laughter, faster decisions, people leaning forward instead of pausing. Across town, Maris saved the last file into her encrypted folder, her hands steady despite the weight of what she was gathering. And inside the settlement draft, waiting on Sabine's desk, a single clause sat unnoticed, an audit trigger written so carefully that it looked like routine procedure, even as it waited to change the direction of everything once the ink dried. The courtroom was louder than a funeral and quieter than a confession. Cameras lined the back wall, their red lights blinking like patient witnesses. Reporters whispered to each other, flipping through notes that already framed the story as a clean transfer of power. The widow who stepped aside, the children who carried the legacy forward. Sabine stood near the front with a confidence that filled the room before she even spoke, her hand resting lightly on the table as if ownership had already settled into her bones. Lysander looked composed, though I noticed the way he kept adjusting his cufflinks, a small nervous habit Corwin used to have when something mattered more than he admitted. Quentin stood just behind them, posture relaxed, eyes moving across the courtroom like a man reviewing an investment he expected to mature quickly. Vance sat beside me, quiet and still. Last chance, he murmured without turning his head. Once you sign, the narrative changes. It already has, I replied softly. Judge Elric entered, his presence shifting the air from anticipation to structure. The clerk called the case, voices lowered, and the settlement documents were placed in front of me. Thick, precise, heavy with legal language that disguised years of history in a few pages. Sabine leaned closer to Lysander, whispering something that made him smile briefly. Cameras clicked, and somewhere behind us, a reporter whispered, "This is the moment." Maybe it was, just not the one they thought. Caspian, the opposing lawyer, adjusted his tie and nodded toward the documents. "We appreciate Miss Ardella's willingness to resolve this matter efficiently," he said, his voice smooth, rehearsed. "All parties have agreed to a voluntary transfer of ownership and operational control, effective immediately upon execution." Voluntary. The word sounded harmless to anyone who didn't know what it carried underneath. I picked up the pen. For a moment, I thought about Corwin, the late nights, the quiet strategies, the envelope Odell had kept safe all those years. I thought about Sabine's speeches, Lysander's signatures, Quentin's urgency, and then I signed. No pause, no hesitation. So ink moved across paper like the closing of a chapter everyone believed was finished. A ripple moved through the courtroom, whispers, shifting bodies, the faint sound of relief. Sabine exhaled softly, her shoulders dropping as if a weight had finally lifted. She leaned toward me just enough for her words to stay private. "You made the right choice," she whispered. "This will be easier for everyone now." I met her eyes calmly. "I hope it is," I said. Lysander nodded politely, already turning toward Quentin as if the future required immediate planning. Cameras captured every angle. The handshake, the exchanged documents, the image of a woman stepping aside without protest. Vance said nothing. He didn't need to, because the signing wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something none of them had paused long enough to see. Judge Elric glanced toward Caspian. "Counselor, please read the final settlement terms into the record." Caspian rose smoothly, confident, flipping open the document with practiced ease. "As agreed," he began, voice steady, "ownership transfers under voluntary relinquishment, including all associated operational authorities." Sabine sat back, satisfied. Quentin crossed his arms, already relaxed. Lysander watched the room like a man stepping into certainty. Caspian continued reading. Clauses about governance, timelines, procedural acknowledgments, each line reinforcing the story they believed they had written. And then his voice slowed, just slightly. His eyes moved back to a paragraph, scanning it again. The room shifted almost imperceptibly. He cleared his throat and continued, but the rhythm had changed, less fluid now, more deliberate. "Upon voluntary transfer under accelerated conditions," he read slowly, "a comprehensive operational audit shall be enacted immediately to verify compliance with fiduciary obligations." Sabine's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Quentin's posture straightened. Lysander leaned forward. Caspian paused, flipping back a page as if confirming something he had missed before. The courtroom grew quieter, curiosity replacing celebration. And for the first time that morning, the man who had arrived so confident in victory hesitated before reading the next line aloud. Caspian didn't stumble over words. He stopped, mid-sentence. His eyes moved across the page again, slower this time, like a man realizing he had walked into a room he didn't understand. The courtroom, still buzzing from the signing moments earlier, began to quiet as people sensed the shift. Even the reporters lowered their pens. "A comprehensive operational audit," he repeated, voice no longer smooth, "shall be enacted immediately upon voluntary relinquishment under accelerated conditions." Sabine leaned forward. "That's standard compliance language," she said quickly, her tone tight with impatience. But Caspian didn't respond. He kept reading silently, lips barely moving, one hand pressing flat against the document like he was holding it in place. The confidence he carried earlier drained from his posture, replaced by calculation. Quentin straightened beside Lysander. "Continue," he said quietly, though the edge in his voice made it sound more like a command. Caspian cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I would like to review this clause before proceeding." Judge Elric didn't look surprised. He adjusted his glasses, gaze steady. "Counselor, the agreement was submitted by all parties. Please read it into the record." The room held its breath. Caspian inhaled slowly and continued, his voice sharper now. Under Section 14, any voluntary transfer executed during a period of accelerated asset liquidation triggers an immediate independent audit of operational decisions, asset sales, and financial authorizations conducted within the preceding 90 days. 90 days. Sabine's smile faded completely. Lysander's pen stilled in his hand. Quentin's jaw tightened. The first crack I had seen in his composure since the hearing began. Murmurs rippled through the gallery as reporters exchanged glances. The word audit carries weight in a room built on reputation. This wasn't discussed, Sabine said under her breath, though loud enough for those nearby to hear. Vance remained silent beside me, his stillness louder than any argument. Judge Elric leaned forward slightly. "Is there an objection to the clause?" he asked evenly. Caspian hesitated. "No objection, Your Honor, but the implications require clarification." "Then clarify," the judge replied. Caspian continued reading, slower now, every word landing heavier than the last. "The audit shall be conducted by an independent firm appointed by the court, with authority to review executive authorizations, vendor agreements, shipment records, and compliance documentation tied to recent restructuring decisions." Quentin shifted in his seat, eyes moving quickly toward Lysander. Then Sabine, silent communication passing between them like a warning nobody wanted to voice. I didn't move. I didn't smile. I simply listened. Because this wasn't revenge, it was structure doing exactly what it was built to do. Sabine leaned toward Caspian, whispering urgently, "Can we pause this? Request a recess?" But Judge Elric raised a hand before the request fully formed. "The agreement has been executed," he said calmly. "Procedural clauses stand unless formally contested." Lysander's voice came out quieter than before. "What does this mean exactly?" Caspian didn't answer right away. He flipped through the pages again, slower, more careful, like a man retracing steps he wished he had taken earlier. "It means," he said finally, "that all recent financial decisions fall under immediate review." The room shifted, not dramatically, and just enough that the celebration energy dissolved into uncertainty. Sabine sat back slowly, her expression tightening as realization began to settle in. Quentin stared forward, calculating, already searching for an angle that might slow what had just begun. Across the room, reporters leaned forward, sensing a story turning in real time. Judge Elric tapped his pen once against the bench. "Given the activation of this clause," he said, voice steady, "the court will initiate a preliminary review of compliance documentation." He paused, scanning the room. First Caspian, then Sabine and Lysander, then briefly me. "The matter requires immediate attention," he continued. "An emergency review session will be scheduled to determine the scope of the audit." The words landed like a quiet thunderclap. Sabine's fingers tightened around the edge of the table. Lysander swallowed, eyes fixed on the documents, as if hoping the language might change if he read it differently. Quentin's confidence finally cracked, not loudly, just enough that the room felt it. Judge Elric closed the file with deliberate care. "This hearing is adjourned," he said. "Parties will be notified of the emergency review date within 48 hours. The gavel didn't slam. It didn't need to. Because the moment Caspian stopped reading, the story everyone thought had ended began moving in a direction none of them could rush past anymore. Audits don't shout. They arrive quietly. Spreadsheets, timelines, signatures. And then they begin rearranging reality piece by piece. The independent review moved faster than anyone expected. Within days, our investigators requested shipment logs, vendor agreements, and authorization trails tied to every accelerated decision made since the leadership transition. What started as a procedural review quickly turned into a pattern nobody could ignore. Inventory gaps appeared first. Not missing goods, just approvals that moved faster than documentation. Transfers signed under emergency restructuring. Projections inflated enough to justify selling assets earlier than planned. None of it looked dramatic on its own. Together, it painted a picture of leadership moving too quickly to see where the ground shifted beneath them. Quentin stopped attending public meetings. At first, Sabine framed his absence as strategic scheduling. But word spread quickly when the audit team traced consulting payments back to external entities tied to a rival firm, the same one that had attempted to acquire Corwin's company years ago. It wasn't illegal to consult across networks, but the lack of disclosure raised questions nobody could easily silence. Board members who once nodded along with Quentin's urgency now spoke more cautiously. And for the first time since Corwin's funeral, Lysander stopped signing documents. The authority he carried so confidently began to narrow under procedural review. Temporary restrictions were placed on executive approvals until the audit concluded. A technical step, but one that felt heavier than any public accusation. I attended the follow-up session quietly, sitting near the back while the findings were summarized. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontations, just facts read into the record, dates, signatures, timelines, structure revealing itself. Sabine sat across the room, posture stiff, her earlier confidence replaced by something more fragile. She avoided my gaze at first, focusing instead on the stack of reports in front of her. When the auditors described how accelerated decisions bypassed traditional oversight, her expression tightened, not with anger, but with something closer to realization. After the session ended, she approached me in the hallway, not publicly, not with cameras nearby. "I didn't know," she said quietly. Her voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "I thought we were protecting what Dad built," she added, so eyes searching mine like she wanted an answer that would undo everything. "I believe you," I replied gently. She swallowed hard. "Everyone thinks I pushed you out, that I erased you on purpose." "You did what you thought was right," I said. "So did I." For a moment, she looked like she wanted to say more, to apologize, to argue, to explain. But the words stayed caught somewhere behind pride and regret. Across the hall, Lysander spoke with Caspian, his posture heavier now, shoulders no longer lifted by early victory. Authority changes how people carry themselves. Losing it changes them even more. Quentin didn't appear. By evening, the board issued a formal notice. Pending final audit results, operational control would shift temporarily to an oversight committee. Stability before speed, the same principle Corwin had always believed in. Davance called me later that night. "They're offering reinstatement," he said without preamble. "Full executive authority until the audit concludes. The board thinks you're the only one who can steady things right now." I stood by the window, watching the city lights flicker against the river. The same view I had when I first started rebuilding my life outside the company. "What do you think?" he asked. I didn't answer immediately. Power returning always sounds like justice. But justice and dignity don't always walk the same path. "I told you this might happen," Vance added quietly. "The structure is doing exactly what Corwin designed it to do." "I know," I said. He waited. "They want you back at the head of the table," he continued. "All you have to do is say yes." The word hovered between us. Yes. I looked at my advisory desk, or at the work I had built quietly while everyone else chased headlines. I thought about Sabine's voice in the hallway, the weight in Lysander's silence, the way Quentin's influence unraveled once speed exposed its cracks. Reinstated power wasn't the same as reclaimed peace. "I'll give you an answer soon," I said finally. After the call ended, I sat alone with the decision. The company within reach, again. The future balance between returning to the table and leaving it behind for good. Because sometimes the greatest shift isn't taking back control. It's deciding whether you still want it at all. The room felt smaller without celebration. No cameras, no speeches, just the board seated quietly while the final audit summary rested on the table between us. The findings weren't explosive, no dramatic accusations, or no public humiliation, only clear evidence of rushed approvals, undisclosed advisory ties, and decisions made faster than the structure could support. The company wasn't ruined, but it had come close enough for everyone to feel the edge. Quentin's name appeared in the report more than anyone expected. His influence had shaped timelines, encouraged liquidation, and blurred lines that Corwin once kept firm. He wasn't charged with anything criminal, but the board severed his advisory role immediately, replacing urgency with oversight. Lysander spoke less than usual. He looked older, not in years, but in weight. The responsibility he once carried like a trophy now rested on him like something earned through consequence. When the auditors explained how several approvals bypassed traditional safeguards, he didn't argue. He nodded slowly, though absorbing each word like a man realizing that leadership wasn't just authority. It was restraint. Sabine sat across from me, hands folded tightly in her lap. The sharp confidence she wore at the memorial had softened into something quieter. She avoided looking at me at first, but when the meeting ended and people began gathering their papers, she stepped closer. "I thought strength meant pushing forward," she said, voice low. "I didn't realize it could look like waiting." I met her gaze calmly. "Strength changes shape when you listen long enough," I replied. She nodded, not fully healed, but no longer defensive. Accountability doesn't arrive as a single apology. It arrives slowly through recognition. Vance stood near the door, watching the board finalize restructuring terms. New safeguards built around the company's governance. Oversight committees added to prevent future decisions from moving too quickly. Corwin's architecture, once invisible, now formed the backbone of everything they rebuilt. And then the offer came again. "Ardella," Odell said gently, his voice carrying the authority of years spent guiding the company through storms. "The board formally invites you to resume executive leadership. The position is yours if you want it." The room grew quiet. Sabine looked at me, hope and hesitation mixing in her expression. Lysander didn't speak, but the way he straightened slightly told me he expected my return, maybe even needed it. I thought about the office that had been cleared, the plaque that erased my name, the silence that turned into guilt in other people's eyes. I thought about the small advisory space I had built from nothing, and the clients who trusted me without history attached to my presence. Power waited at the table. Peace waited somewhere else. "I appreciate the offer," I said finally, my voice steady, "but I'm not coming back." No one spoke, not immediately. Sabine blinked, surprised. Lysander's shoulders dropped slightly, not in disappointment but in understanding. Even Vance looked at me longer than usual, as if measuring how much strength it took to refuse something others believed I deserved. "I didn't step away to make a point," I continued gently. "I stepped away because the company needed to learn how to stand without leaning on one person. You've begun that process. Now you need to finish it yourselves." Odell nodded slowly, respect settling into his expression. The restructuring moved forward without me at the center. Safeguards tightened. Oversight strengthened. The company didn't return to what it was under Corwin. It became something steadier, shaped by the lessons nobody could ignore anymore. Weeks later, I stood at the window of my advisory office, watching the river move with the same quiet patience it always had. Clients came and went. My name built a different legacy now, not tied to inheritance battles or courtroom headlines, but to clarity, to guidance, to work that felt entirely my own. Sabine called occasionally, conversations softer than before. Lysander sent updates about the company, not for approval, just to share progress. The distance between us no longer felt like exile. It felt like space where respect could grow slowly. I never returned to the boardroom. I didn't need to, because dignity isn't always found in reclaiming what was taken. Sometimes it's found in choosing where you stand after everything changes. People still asked why I didn't fight harder, why I walked away so easily. I never corrected them. They thought I surrendered. They thought silence meant weakness. But I knew the truth long before the hearing ended, long before the audit began, long before the company learned how fragile speed can be when it outruns wisdom. They thought I walked away because I was weak. I walked away because I knew exactly where they were running. And I had already built the ground beneath their feet.